All right, we're back with another fantasy football team preview, going over all 32 teams for this year's fantasy season, talking about every player. If it's your first time here to the channel, I'm going over every single fantasy football team and talking every player. Yeah, I'm doing that. And if you're a member of the channel, you get early access to the video, so congratulations if you are. And if you're not, you might find it valuable a little bit later on down the year too. So we're going to talk today about the Cincinnati Bengals. Y'all like the Cincinnati Bengals? How y'all feeling about the Cincinnati Bengals, huh? So we're going to talk about the Cincinnati Bengals. And this team last year kind of disappointed, I would say. Obviously, with when you talk about Jake Browning having to come in, Joe Burrow getting hurt, dealing with the injury early on, this team didn't meet expectations. This is a team a lot of people had in the playoffs, contending for a championship. Injuries kind of dismantled this team. And then they made a couple changes during this offseason as well. T. Higgins requested a trade. Joe Mixon actually did get traded to the Houston Texans. So this entire team, man, it's going to look a little different this year with the same kind of base. I don't know how to say that in any better terms, but it's going to look like a similar offense, but it's going to be a little bit different. All right, so I'm going to go over quarterback play, running back play, wide receiver play, and that's really about it, man. So, like I said, make sure you drop a like, drop a sub to the channel while you're here. Starting off with Joe Burrow. He had an injury-plagued season last year, and started off coming into the year, he was injured. Jamarr Chase wanted him to sit out. He played with that calf early on, and then he injured his wrist, and he finishes a QB 25, which is a really subpar season for Joe Burrow. Only had 2,000 yards, like 2,300 yards passing, 15 touchdowns. It just wasn't a good year for me. Played through the injury, then got hurt towards the end, and we saw Jake Browning come in and lead this team. So what do you really expect from Joe Burrow? He's going to – last year he was being taken as the top 7 to 8 fantasy quarterback with good reason, right? He had finished the top 5 the year before that. So there was a big expectation that Joe Burrow could challenge to be a top 5 quarterback again, and he fell outside the top 20 due to the injuries, right? On a per-game basis, he was a QB2 most weeks. So the receiving core is still there, right? You still got Jamar Chase. T. Higgins has not been traded as of yet, and the team also has addressed receiver in the mid-rounds of the draft the last couple seasons. So I think Joe Burrow is who he is. He's a back-end QB1, high-end QB2 that has potential to have mega weeks. It doesn't shock anybody when Joe Burrow throws for 400 yards and 5 touchdowns. That wouldn't be a shock to anybody. But to see it on a consistent basis and in the season, top 5 would be a shock this year, especially because there's some other candidates. So I think he belongs more in the back-end QB1 conversation than the high-end QB2 conversation. And I do think that there's a little bit of value when it comes to Joe Burrow this season. Anytime somebody gets hurt or anytime somebody disappoints the year before, we typically get good value on them. And I believe with Joe Burrow, we might get an element of that. If he's going around like Trevor Lawrence, or maybe somebody's thinking about taking Caleb Williams over him, that is the time to strike, especially if he can stay upright this season, which Joe Burrow has come out and said his goal is to stay healthy this year. He's kind of been injury prone. A lot of people want to say that about other quarterbacks. Joe Burrow himself has had trouble staying on the field consistently throughout his career. So we want to see a clean season from him. Hopefully the O-line, which has been improved over the last years, can keep him upright. We need Joe Burrow to be healthy full season, and we'll see what we can get out of him. I expect at least back in QB1 numbers if he's able to stay upright all season long. And then when it comes to running back, I talked about Joe Mixon being out of the picture now. He traded to the Texans. This team now has 2 running backs. They had Chase Brown, who kind of had opportunity in the second half of last season, showed some explosive plays. We saw that long 80-yard touchdown. Had some decent performances down the stretch as the number 2 running back. And he had he had a game that was almost 20 points. But Zach Moss is also there as well now. Zach Moss had a strong season with the Indianapolis Colts. So I like what Chase Brown brings as far as explosiveness, but it kind of feels like he's going to be in a shared backfield. Very similar to a Joe Mixon, Samaje Perine type backfield, right? And I think that's what this Bengals team wants. They want a little bit of fire and ice, a little bit of whatever odd combination, lightning and thunder, or whatever the hell you want to call it, right? A nice balance attack when it comes to the run game. So they want to keep their bodies fresh. And Chase Brown offers a lot in the passing game too. So No more Joe Mixon there. I think it means more work for Chase Brown, but he's going to have to earn it. He didn't play consistently down the stretch. Like I said, had a couple big performances, but didn't play consistently down the stretch to earn, the lion's share of the rushing work. So when it comes to Chase Brown, I think that he'll be a good player. Somebody that's more, I think he's going to be more flex at best type thing during bye weeks. I think Zach Moss is going to end up being the running back to own. And Zach Moss last year, he played really well in the starting role for the Colts. And it's still going to be a 1A, 1B type thing. I think there'll be some weeks where we see Chase Brown better, some weeks where we see Zach Moss better. But I think Zach Moss is the safer of the two picks. It'll probably be an RB3 flex play at times throughout the year. He can handle 20 touches. He played well with that, right? And when he was in the starting role, I mean, he smashed the spot, right? It was when Jonathan Taylor came back and he had to go back to that reserve role. There was a couple weeks where he played well, but then he completely fell off because he wasn't getting the volume touches. So in a timeshare, he does have appeal, especially, I mean, last year, even with the way I'm talking about him, how he fell off, he still had over, 700 yards, almost 800 yards, 794 with 5 TDs, had a little bit of work in the passing game with, almost 200 yards in the passing game. So he finished as an RB3 last year. He was an RB31 or RB4 in your 10-team leagues, whatever you want to call it. He was an RB3-ish type play, and during the weeks when he was starting, he was more of like an RB2, high-end RB2 type play. So I think that he'll be in a timeshare. If something happens and there's an injury for one of the two, they would automatically vault up into like the RB2 conversation. But if we're seeing 15 to 20 touches out of Zach Moss, I feel very confident in his ability to return RB3 value throughout the season. So I wouldn't draft him as an RB3. I think you can get him better, like at a discount, maybe RB4 range. But we've talked about this on this channel before. A lot of times when there's two running backs in a split, one of them ends up outperforming their ADP. And I think we're going to see that out of Chase Brown or Zach Moss. Most pundits are probably going to say Zach Moss. I think Chase Brown offers higher upside. Zach Moss is the safer of the two. Okay. Now we got to get to the receiving core. The receiving core, obviously, Jamarr Chase. Jamarr Chase, man. This is a player that, it's time. Now, we saw such a strong rookie campaign, and he's dealt with injuries. Burrow's been hurt. It's like we haven't seen that just breakout number one, I am the dog season from Jamarr Chase that a lot of people expected to happen last season. We're still taking him at the top of drafts. He's still a top 3 to 4 receiver, but we're looking for like that Justin Jefferson, can you get 2,000 yards type season? Can you get 10 to 15 touchdowns type season, right? Last year, he finished as the wide receiver 11, which obviously, like I said, due to Joe Burrow's injuries and just inconsistent play across the board from him, finished with 1,200 yards receiving and 7 touchdowns. So a good season for most receivers. This is underwhelming, though, when it comes to Jamarr Chase, who we're expecting to push 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns each season. So I think Jamarr Chase is still worthy of a top 4 wide receiver selection this year. He's going to go with the Tyreek Hills, the Justin Jeffersons, the CeeDee Lambs. He belongs up there, right? Still elite and still has potential to be the wide receiver 1 any given season. We got to see Joe Burrow stay healthy, and we got to see Jamarr Chase stay healthy. Both of those two things need to happen. And if anything happens on the T. Higgins front and he gets traded, that arrow goes up even more. So we know Jamarr Chase is not scared of the big moment. We know he asked for the football too, and he's like, yo, give me as many targets as you can. And even when Drake Browning came in, he was still providing plays. So I think we need to see a healthy season from both of those two, and we'll see what we really have with Jamarr Chase, which I still believe is a top 3 to 5 wide receiver in this league, and he belongs there in draft spots for fantasy leagues as well, okay? Now, T. Higgins is the other player we talked about, and he had a really disappointing season. We haven't seen anything better than a wide receiver 18 season out of T. Higgins. And, I mean, we were drafting him last year as like a top 12, 15 option. Like, I was really high on T. Higgins last year. And there was times when Jamarr Chase and T. Higgins were both in the lineup together that T. Higgins looked like the better receiver. Like there was debates at times who was the number 1 wide receiver. And we just haven't seen T. Higgins string together a consistent season, a healthy season. And unfortunately for him, he only played 12 games last year, and now he's coming up on contract talks and needs to get extended out and is requested a trade. And You know, he's got to show up. He's got to show up. I think T. Higgins, if he wants to get traded or he wants to get a big contract out of somebody, this is obviously a big year to do that. And he'll have opportunity with Joe Mixon out of the fold, with some younger players in there and less talented players surrounding him now. He's going to have his opportunity. So he only had 600 yards last year, 5 touchdowns in those 12 games. He needs a mega season. He needs 1,200 yards, 8 to 10 touchdowns. Burrow's got to stay healthy. He has an opportunity to do it. So if we can get T. Higgins outside of the top 25 receivers, which I think analysts are going to say fade T. Higgins this year, he might be a player that I'm still buying into. I think we'll get T. Higgins at a discount, and if he really is playing for the money that he wants, I think he needs to show up, and he will show up. So might he miss a couple games? Yes, it's always a risk when it comes to T. Higgins. He's shown that in his career, unfortunately, but with the big body and his ability to get things downfield, to get the ball in the red zone, I'm still buying T. Higgins as a player that has potential to be a wide receiver 2 any given week of the year. So I'm still in on T. Higgins. I think that he's going to be a steal at value. We got to see where the ADP lands once the season gets a little bit closer. And then Jermaine Burton was the 3rd-round pick for this Bengals team. They have a bunch of like 4th-round receivers. We've seen guys, Trent Irwin's even come out and have production. So for me, I'm not really in on a 3rd receiver, but they are missing Tyler Boyd. He hasn't signed with the team yet, and I don't know if he's expected to return. So until he does that, Jermaine Burton was drafted as a 3rd-round pick out of Alabama. This is a guy that can be an explosive playmaker downfield. He has 4.4 speed, but he's known as a deep threat downfield. I don't expect him to take anything away from Jamarr Chase or T. Higgins, but if one of those two were to get, missing any kind of time, Burton's the type of player that could come in and potentially be a wide receiver 3, a risky, albeit, but wide receiver 3 type candidate for your teams during bye week. So that's if any of those two misses time. I'm not expecting a whole lot of him in his rookie campaign. Probably will be a 500-yard receiver for 3 to 4 touchdown type play, but I'm not expecting huge numbers out of Burton. But this Bengals offense does utilize all 3 receivers at times, and he'll have his opportunity along with a couple other players in this receiving core. Not overly excited. I think this would be a next year play, and that's if T. Higgins is gone. And he's kind of more of a deep threat than a consistent every down receiver. And then lastly, Mike Gesicki was added to this team, tight end wise from the Dolphins. The only thing that we're going to get out of him is an improved gritty, right, with Jamarr Chase. That's what we expected. I'm not expecting much out of Gesicki. The team don't really use a tight end as much, but he plays like a wide receiver. So the range of outcomes for Gesicki on a week-to-week basis is probably going to be like, there's going to be some weeks where he looks like tight end 1. There's going to be some weeks where he looks like a waiver player, which is probably where he's going to be most of the season. So don't be surprised if you see some outlier performances from Gesicki along the way, 70 yards in a TD, 5 catch games. Like, we're probably going to see a few touchdowns out of him and some double gritties with him and Jamarr Chase, but I'm not expecting much as far as fantasy. If you got him as a tight end too, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world, but Bengals don't really utilize the tight end. Everybody was expecting Irv Smith to have this crazy year. He didn't as well. I think it's expecting a lot of the same when it comes to this Bengals tight end core. So hopefully I covered everybody that you were interested in fantasy-wise for the Bengals. If not, go ahead and drop a comment with the player that I missed, or maybe somebody you want more information on. If you have any trades dynasty-wise with these guys, feel free to drop it in the chat. And if you disagree with anything too, let me know. Let me hear your side of it. Until the next one, peace out.